All right, welcome back, everyone. For those just joining us, we're in the middle of a deep dive into modern Indian history. Super relevant for you, UPSC folks out there, gearing up for GS1.
That's right. Last time we set the stage, and today we're tackling a real game changer, the permanent settlement system.
Oh yeah, the permanent settlement. Sounds kind of simple at first glance, but I have a feeling it wasn't so straightforward, was it?
Not at all. It gets pretty complex. Introduced in 1793 by Lord Cornwallis, it's also known as the Stye Bandobast system, and its effects are still felt even today.
Wow, 1793, that's going way back. And it wasn't applied everywhere in India, right?
Correct. It started in Bengal and Bihar, then later spread to Madras and Varanasi.
Okay, so some of the most important agricultural areas. Why those places? What was the thinking behind this permanent settlement?
Revenue collection. The British, they were all about maximizing profit, and they wanted a system that was predictable and easy to manage.
Makes sense, from their perspective at least.
Yeah.
So how did they think this system would solve that?
They decided to work with the Zamindars. They basically made them landowners. The Zamindars would then collect rent from the cultivators and pay a fixed amount to the British.
Hold on, wasn't that a huge shift? I thought the Zamindars were more like tax collectors under the Mughals, right?
Exactly. You're right. This system totally changed who owned the land. Cultivators went from having a direct relationship with the land to becoming tenants.
Sounds like a good deal for the British, but what about the Zamindars? Did they just get free reign?
Not quite. The British took a huge chunk. Nearly 11ths of the revenue went straight to them. Zamindars were only left with 111th.
Wow. Talk about an uneven split.
Yeah.
But what happened if there was a bad harvest? The land wouldn't produce as much, right?
You've hit on a major problem with the system. The demand was fixed, drought, flood, it didn't matter. Zamindars were still on the hook for the full amount.
That's tough. So if they couldn't get enough from the cultivators, they were in trouble.
You got it. It put a lot of pressure on them to squeeze as much as possible from the cultivators, which often led to, some pretty harsh practices.
So even though it's supposed to make things simpler, it seems like it caused even more problems.
Yeah, kind of backfired on them. But you have to see it from their point of view at the time. Guaranteed revenue without dealing with individual cultivators seemed like a win-win.
Like a streamlined tax system.
Precisely. Plus, there's the political angle. Empowering the Zamindars basically created a loyal class to help them maintain control.
Clever, but definitely a bit cynical. So you're pitting Zamindars against cultivators. Did all the Zamindars just go along with this?
That's where it gets interesting. While some Zamindars became wealthy and powerful, there were definitely cases of resentment, even rebellion. And for the cultivators, well, it wasn't pretty.
We've talked a lot about the British and the Zamindars. What about the people who actually worked the land? What was it like for them?
That's an important point, and it's something we'll explore more as we go deeper. But first, let's take a look at some of the less obvious effects of the permanent settlement. It wasn't just revenue. It impacted land use, social dynamics, even the environment.
You mentioned the impact on the cultivators. Let's talk about that. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, but this was about people's lives.
Absolutely. For most cultivators, this permanent settlement, well, it didn't exactly feel very permanent when it came to their own security.
So how did this system, which seemed to just be about taxes, end up affecting everyday farmers so much?
Imagine you're a cultivator, you've worked this land for generations, and suddenly you're not in control anymore. You're a tenant now, and you have a zamindar who owns the land. And that zamindar, he's got to get as much revenue as he can.
Because of that fixed revenue demand from the British.
Right, so the whole power dynamic shifts. A lot of zamindars were absentee landlords living in the city, not on the land. They relied on others to collect rent.
We talked about the Lathials before, the enforcers. Not exactly a peaceful scene in the countryside then.
It was a tough time for many cultivators. Unreasonable rents, debt, it was a cycle of poverty that was hard to break. And it wasn't just about money either, it had social consequences too.
Social consequences. How so?
The system created new social hierarchies, made existing ones even worse. The Zamindars, they had money and power now, and they often sided with the British.
So you have this group of wealthy Zamindars propping up British rule while the cultivators are stuck dealing with the problems.
That's a good way to put it. And remember, this wasn't just in Bengal. As the British expanded, they took versions of this system to other parts of India. Similar outcomes too.
It's amazing how this revenue system had ripple effects everywhere. Economic, social, political.
And there's one more thing we haven't talked about. The environment. The Zamindars, they needed to get as much as they could from the land to pay the British.
Short-term gain over long-term sustainability.
Exactly. There's evidence that this focus on immediate revenue actually contributed to deforestation, soil erosion, even the decline of traditional farming
Is
methods.
another case of colonial policies putting profit before people and the land.
It makes you wonder, what if they had done things differently? What if they had actually considered the needs of the cultivators, the health of the environment?
It's a big what-if in history. Were there any other options they could have considered? Maybe something that would have led to a better outcome for India.
That's a great question. As we continue our deep dive, you'll see that there were indeed other options being considered, each with its own pros and cons.
So back in the late 1700s, the British are trying to figure out how to manage all this land they control. The permanent settlement with its zamindars and fixed revenue, that was just one idea they had. What were some of the other options they were looking at?
Well, another system that became popular, especially in Madras and Bombay, was the Riat-Wari system. This one actually cut out the zamindars entirely.
Really? So no more middlemen.
Yeah.
They went directly to the cultivators.
Exactly. They wanted to assess and collect revenue directly from the farmers, the riots. Sounds a bit fair, don't you think?
It does. Dealing directly with the people working the land. That seems like it would fix some of the problems with the Zamindari system.
In theory, yeah. The Riat-Wari system, it aimed to create a direct link between the government and the farmer. But it had its own problems in practice.
I bet. Trying to manage revenue from millions of individual farmers across a huge area like India, that must have been a logistical nightmare, even back then.
You're right, it was a massive undertaking. And there was always the worry that officials could abuse their power, setting unfair revenue rates for farmers.
So even though it seemed fairer in theory, the Riat-Wari system could still be used to exploit farmers, just in a different way.
Exactly. No system is perfect. Each one has its own downsides. And then there's a third option, kind of like a mix of the two, the Mahalwari
That's
system.
hybrid system. What was that like?
The Mahalwari system, it took bits from both the Zamindari and the Riat-Wari systems. They made revenue settlements with entire village communities, or mahals, not with individuals or big zamindars.
So like a shared responsibility kind of thing. The whole village would be responsible for paying the revenue.
Exactly. It was about using the existing social structure of the village, maybe soften some of the harsher parts of the other systems.
That's interesting. So the British had three very different ways to collect revenue. Zamindari, Riat-Wari, and this Mahalwari mix. Each one with its own pluses and minuses. Makes you wonder, what if they had gone with a different approach?
It does, doesn't it? That's what's so fascinating about history. We can look back and ask those what-if questions. Could the Riat-Wari system, with its direct connection to cultivators, have led to a fairer, more prosperous life for farmers?
Or would it just become another way to exploit them?
And what about the Mahalwari system? Could that focus on the community have made society stronger, help them face British rule better?
So many possibilities. It really shows how even simple administrative decisions can have such huge and lasting consequences.
And that's a key takeaway for our UPSC aspirants listening. Don't just memorize the facts. Really think about the material. Ask the what-if questions.
Absolutely. And with that, we wrap up our deep dive into the permanent settlement system. Hope you all learned something valuable, not just for your exams, but for understanding this important period in India's history.
Remember, history isn't just a list of facts. It's a conversation, a debate. Keep asking questions. Keep exploring.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it. We'll be back with more fascinating topics soon. Until then, keep those minds curious.